Hi everybody, I'm Bree the Plant Lady, and I am checking in early for a late January garden tour because we have a 100% chance of snow tomorrow, which would be the last day of this month. So I thought I would walk around with all of you today to show you how things are shaking out for this month. We've been not exceptionally cold, but in recent years, we've had a lot of temperature fluctuations where we're chilly, but then we warm up into the 60s. This month, we haven't had that at all. It's been consistently cool, not exceptionally cold, but never really warm. And so that's really the first time in the 10 years that this garden has existed that we've had this kind of steady weather pattern. So it's amazing how different the plants are performing in contrast to every year prior. So generally everything is really behind. As I go through pictures from years past, I'm just shocked by the contrast from year to year, but especially this year, everything is just kind of on pause. So we'll start here, right off the back patio with the feed tank bed. And I really could vacuum this. People always ask how I maintain this. We treat it like a swimming pool. It's got a filter and a pump. Those aren't running right now. We do have a fountain in the center. We've turned that off for the time being. But we do keep it chlorinated, and I vacuum it with a pool vacuum. Maybe I'll do that today. That would actually be something that would keep me off the couch from watching TV the whole afternoon. But the planting here is looking great. Despite, being cool, these are all plants that like cool weather. So we'll start with the garlic edge that's growing well. The Ms. America mustard, I'm so impressed by. Now these beets, I probably should have harvested these. Oh well. And then of course the yellow violas and the curly parsley are really great. But I do have some weeds in here that I need to deal with. So I wanted to do some weed ID for all of you to distinguish. So here's a poppy. That's something I want to keep. But here's a lamium or henbit. And that's something I need to take out. And at this stage, you see that was really easy to remove and it doesn't have a huge root system. Another weed in here. Oh, now I've got my helper, Ava Grace. And there, just so you know, there's Sophia and there's Cubby sitting in the bed. So another weed issue that I have in here is chickweed, but again, at this stage, it's really easy to remove. So, yeah, I think maybe I'll take this afternoon because it is sunny and not terribly cold to vacuum the pool and weed this bed. That's a good goal for today. Now, one thing I see as I'm kneeling down here is I do have tulips that are starting to poke out. So that's exciting. And, really this bed should look great. There's about 500 tulips planted in here. So, come spring, this is going to be really beautiful. So right adjacent to that is this foundation bed, and I'm really pleased with the feed tank planting. That's barley, garlic, purple violas, and sweet peas back here that are just kind of hanging on. But in front of that, I've got a big mix of problem weeds and good plants. And this gets a little bit tricky. And so as people have been asking, how do you differentiate? A lot of it is just experience. You grow these plants long enough, you can tell the difference. But here again, here are poppies. You see that kind of scalloped edge. And then really right adjacent to it is chickweed. I've got a huge chickweed infestation in here. So this is going to take some very fine-tuned weeding on my hands and knees doing this. I think I'll wait until the soil warms up a little before I attack this bed. Now the opposite side is an area that I just did a few weeks ago. I did the mow in place You can see the roughage from the Phlox paniculata, and then I put in some compost on top of that and then direct seeded. And that seed is starting to germinate. That right here, this I think is all, I think it's all larkspur. Though honestly, I'll have to watch the video to remind myself of what I actually sowed, because I don't remember. But, you know, I'll have to keep my eyes peeled for weeds that I missed that are coming up through. And I am pleased to see that things are germinating in here. And then, of course, the star of this bed right now is the prunus mume. It's not blooming very much, and that's because we've been cold. It started to bloom last week. I did, you know, I forced some branches inside and they looked great. And I thought it was about to just burst into flower, and it just stopped. And that's kind of the case with all the prunus mumes. The flowers that were open have burnt off. A few have opened in the past day or two. But with the forecast being so cold, I think these are going to keep pushing well into February before they really flower. So my 100-gallon root pouches aren't really looking great. They're okay. The broccoli is not really growing much. I'll probably go ahead and harvest these before tomorrow. It's because they're kind of feeling a little limp. Go ahead and do it while I'm talking about it. And it'll be time for me to start more seeds. I have a couple trays that I'm, you know, doing an experiment with, but I usually try to sow seeds every other week, so I'll need to sow some more broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage seeds. So the sunny side of the greenhouse doesn't have much more activity than the other side. You know, growing vegetables through the winter when it's chilly, they don't really do a lot. So see, this crop of broccoli looks a little beat down. Hopefully those will recover once we get warm. But, you know, I grew them from seeds, so I don't really have a lot tied into them. And if they don't succeed, that's okay. I'll just sow more. Now, the prize and joy Edgeworthia that, you know, was a rooted cutting that rooted into the ground, into the pot. And it's my best Edgeworthia, hands down, the best Edgeworthia. It's in the most ridiculous spot. None of these have opened yet either. And this is like a fairly warm microclimate. You know, this is like my work zone. And, you know, it gets reflective heat from the garage. But you can see the buds are still super tight. And every year, until this year, these have been blooming by now. So it's just such an incredible contrast. What consistently chilly weather does and how plants perform. Now this used to be my pride and joy Edgeworthia, but last year I had to cut all the big branches down. You can see the really big woody stalks because those branches actually died. And then this is what grew last summer. And you know, I'm glad to see it has flowers and everything, but it's significantly smaller. And then above that is Pink Panther Prunus mume, and it's not showing any color yet. It's, you know, just really tight buds. You have to, you know, really look to even see the flower buds on this stage. And again, you know, in normal years of the past, these are usually in full bloom, like they look like cotton candy for the last weekend of January. Now this is a plant that I see from my kitchen window and I love it, and I can't wait for it to get significantly larger. This is Croton alabamensis, and it's a great native plant. It gets this really nice kind of orangey color, and then it's really extraordinary because it's got these incredible silver backs to the leaves. So I use these a lot of times in the floating flower arrangements because I just think that silver is so awesome. Plus I love this kind of pumpkin colored leaf. So you know, this year I've been doing a lot of experiments with regard to timing of this direct seeding method. And this is a great example. So back there, that clump of barley there was planted 3 weeks earlier than this. You see how weak this is? I really have to say my mid experiment conclusion is that sowing things like barley, oats, wheat, poppies, larkspur, nigella, you know, all the things that I've been talking about for the last few months, I really think that mid-November to mid-December is better than later. But again, I'm going to keep giving you updates, but you can see the difference between that and that. And this is a thick, healthy clump that will survive, you know, cold temperatures. This is just extraordinarily weak, and you know, I could see this getting damaged with the temperatures that we have forecasted. So this south-facing bed isn't very interesting. I do have plans to expand it out to that crack of the driveway, and then I would like to put in kind of a walking path behind it so that it's more accessible. But the containers here, you see, this is driveway adjacent, south facing exposure. So this is a really great microclimate. And all of these containers look wonderful. I'm especially keen on this one. Get out of that shadow. That combination with some wheat and curly parsley, Swiss chard. I just think that's really pretty. And the live wall is looking good, you know, as good as one would expect for the middle of winter. I still have a couple of pumpkins. I'm gonna bring these inside before tomorrow's snow, because I'm gonna cook them. And I have more that I've stashed inside. I'm still cooking pumpkins every week. My favorite winter interest container plant is definitely this Carex Everillo. And I mean, you just can't beat that. This has been planted in this pot for, I don't know, 3 years. And it looks awesome year round. So if you've not grown any of these new varieties of Carex, I highly recommend getting them. They're all wonderful. Everillo was one of the first to be introduced, and it's this bright yellow. But there's actually a whole bunch of different varieties, and I've probably can't find all the labels, but like here's one that's in that series, and here are others. Here is a label. Let's see. Everoro. That I think is this variegated form. And I have a lot of weeding to do. You can see this patch of rhodia, but mixed in is sedum, and then chickweed and henbit. And this really terrible weed that I call Velcro weed, but this thing is a nightmare. It's really, really, really terrible. And if you don't do any weeding for all this other stuff, make sure you eradicate this, because this just gets exponentially worse and worse and worse. And it sets these seeds that stick to everything, especially cat fur. So that is going to be a top priority for me to come out and deal with. Like my relic of the old-fashioned cell phone. So I showed you all this plant earlier this week on a weed ID tour, and this is what I think is actually Prunus mume bonita. I got it as a lost label plant, and this is always the first to bloom, and I don't know whether it's just the orientation being out here in full sun in my front yard, but I expect that a lot of these open flowers will end up getting nipped off in the coming days with cold temperatures. But there's still a lot of flower buds you can see to come. So I might today go ahead and cut some more branches to force inside, just so I can, you know, enjoy this fragrance, because I know I won't be tromping around out here in snow. So you can see how healthy these big clumps of barley are out here in the foundation. And these were done, you know, the middle of December. It was well before the holidays. I really think that timing is still really the right target zone, particularly for people living in zone 7. I'm excited to compile this, and even though a lot of this information is anecdotal, and of course it's very influenced by our weather systems, I think that direct seed sowing for a cool season is best done, I'll just go ahead and say November, December. But mid-November to mid-December is that target time. There is not much happening over here on the north side of the house. The Camellia japonica October affair has been basically frozen in time with a whole bunch of flower buds that aren't opening. If you follow my Instagram, I've been doing a lot of features like plant profiles, and I did one on Mahonia. This is a species called Mahonia uri bracteata, and this bloomed early November, December, and now it's just showing its fruit set, which I think is really pretty. You can see why its common name is Oregon grape, and that's not exactly the common name for this species, but you know, close enough. More Carex. If you haven't grown Carex, I highly recommend indulging in some Carex. They're really quite fantastic. And yeah, not a lot going on. These garden tours, I hate to say that they're boring, but they sort of are, because there's not a lot of action. So I do see some hellebores opening, or at least showing bud. They're not open yet. And my habit with these is to actually pull every single flower off and float them in arrangements. That way they don't have the capacity to seed, because they self-sow really vigorously. In fact, a lot of these that I'm showing you now are just self-sown seedlings from over the years. That's my strategy for managing them. So I have had a love-hate relationship with hellebores for 20 years. And that is due to my first full-time job after college. I worked as an estate gardener just north of Chapel Hill. And the lady who owns the garden is super knowledgeable, and I learned so much practical information. I also learned a lot about jobs I don't want to ever do again. And that was her rule, that we transplanted hellebores anytime in the winter when it was below 45 degrees and pouring down rain. And it sucks to work in a 42-degree rain day. You know, you're just wet to the bone. Like, I used to fantasize about how much nicer the Midwest was, because in the Midwest, you didn't work outside on a 42-degree rain day. And so I've established my rules for hellebores in that I don't let them ever go to seed, which is why I pick the flowers and I float them in arrangements, because seeing the flowers that way brings me great joy, and I also know that they're not gonna seed and create an invasive habit in my home garden. And so there's a few other things about gardening that I learned while working there, and one thing is about composting. And you know, people will criticize me for not making more of my own, and you know what? I had to turn giant compost piles by hand. That was actually how I started every single day. The first 2 hours of every day were spent turning compost piles. Not with a tractor, with a pitchfork. And you know what? I'm not gonna do that to myself. I can buy compost. The compost I buy is so much better than anything that I would make. Plus, I could never make enough to fulfill all of the needs that I have for a garden this size. So I learned as a gardener full-time working that when I had a garden of my own, I wasn't going to torture myself doing things that I hated, because then that makes a hobby not fun. And so that's my recommendation to you, is to, you know, if you have a job that feels just insurmountable, you know, find a way to hire somebody, or, you know, do your research to figure out how you can work around it, because I don't want gardening to ever feel like this horrible burden that is a chore, because that defeats the purpose of it being a fun activity, right? And it's no different for me, other than that I have worked in this industry now for over 20 years, and along the way I've learned the things I really hate doing. And that includes transplanting hellebores in 40-degree rain, and having to turn compost piles by hand. So don't judge, just recognize that there are ways to work around those things. So this corner of the backyard is looking pretty good. This palm always cheers me up, and I love this alstroemeria. Though it's looking a little ragged, it still is such a great plant for the floating arrangements. And again, this Carex, this is just such a winner for the winter interest garden. And you know, this container, this is a really cool Farfugium called Wavy Gravy. And you know, a lot of these things, they look a little limp. This would probably benefit from not being outside right now, but the pot's too heavy for me to move. And I've been talking about my floating arrangements. You can see, I actually cleaned this one out the other day, and it has basically had a layer of ice on it for several days. And these ones, I think because they have the warmth of the brick behind them, typically don't stay totally frozen, though there's a little bit of ice in here. But these arrangements are now 2 weeks old. So you see how long they last as a result of being outside in the elements. And you can see a little bit of ice, you know, just a light layer here. This is such a fun way to enjoy the flowers of winter. You know, you don't have to get on your hands and knees to enjoy them when you float them in a vessel. Since this tour seems to be all about Carex, here's a couple more looking awesome. And of course, my signature winter interest grains in containers, I think is just a really practical and inexpensive way to jazz up a pot. Well, I wish you guys all the best. Stay warm as we celebrate the last weekend of January. And I hope everything is going well in your gardens. And I look forward to giving updates, hopefully as warmer weather approaches. Thanks so much for watching.